Imagine a nightmare scenario for the Pentagon at the height of the Cold War. Two heavily armed nations, both strategic pillars of the NATO alliance, both equipped with American weapons, suddenly turn their crosshairs away from the Soviet Union and aim them directly at each other. This is not a hypothetical war game. In the scorching summer of 1974, the geopolitical map of the Eastern Mediterranean was completely shattered. Over the course of just 48 hours, a sudden military coup on a localized island plunged the region into chaos and brought Greece and Turkey to the absolute brink of all-out war. At the very center of this storm stood one man, Turkish Prime Minister Bülent Ecevit.
Facing a collapsing diplomatic landscape and immense international pressure, Ecevit was about to make a monumental decision that would permanently split a country in two and leave a deep geopolitical scar that remains visible from space to this very day. To understand how a single island could nearly tear the NATO alliance apart, you have to look at the incredibly fragile foundation upon which the Republic of Cyprus was built. Sitting at the strategic crossroads of Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, Cyprus had always been a coveted prize. For centuries, it was a mosaic of ethnicities, but by the mid-20th century, its population was distinctly divided into a Greek Cypriot majority, making up roughly 80% of the island, and a Turkish Cypriot minority, comprising about 18%. When Cyprus finally gained independence from the British Empire in 1960, the new state was designed as a delicate balancing act. A complex constitution was drafted to share power between the two communities, and a unique international agreement known as the Treaty of Guarantee was signed. This treaty named Greece, Turkey, and the United Kingdom as guarantor powers, legally granting them the right to intervene if the constitutional order of Cyprus was ever overthrown. But ink on paper could not erase deep-rooted nationalist ambitions. Many Greek Cypriots passionately believed in enosis, the ultimate political union of Cyprus with mainland Greece. Conversely, as intercommunal violence repeatedly flared up throughout the 1960s, driving thousands of Turkish Cypriots into fortified enclaves for their own survival, the Turkish community increasingly looked toward Taksim, or the physical partition of the island. By the early 1970s, the situation had become a geopolitical powder keg, and the match that would eventually light it was struck in Athens. Greece was under the iron-fisted rule of a right-wing military junta. The Greek dictators viewed the president of Cyprus, Archbishop Makarios III, as a dangerous obstacle. Makarios, though ethnically Greek, had largely abandoned the immediate pursuit of enosis, preferring to keep Cyprus an independent and non-aligned state. To the colonels in Athens, this was an unacceptable betrayal of Hellenic destiny. On the morning of July 15, 1974, the powder keg detonated. Heavily armed units of the Cypriot National Guard, strictly commanded by Greek officers loyal to the junta in Athens, launched a sudden and violent coup d'état in the capital city of Nicosia. Tanks rolled through the streets, artillery pounded the presidential palace, and the world held its breath as reports circulated that Makarios was dead. Though Makarios miraculously escaped through a back door and eventually fled the island, the damage was done. The junta swiftly installed Nikos Samson as the new president of Cyprus. Samson was a notorious ultra-nationalist former guerrilla fighter, fiercely dedicated to enosis and deeply despised by the Turkish Cypriot community. The news of the coup sent immediate shockwaves across the Mediterranean and landed like a bombshell in Ankara. Prime Minister Bülent Ecevit, a politician primarily known for his intellectual demeanor and background as a poet and journalist, was suddenly thrust into the role of a wartime leader. For Ecevit and the Turkish government, the installation of Niko Samson was not merely a change in leadership, it was the blatant annexation of Cyprus by Greece in all but name. Furthermore, given Samson's violent history, Ankara viewed the coup as an existential, immediate threat to the lives of the Turkish Cypriot minority. Ecevit knew the clock was ticking.
If the coup government was allowed to consolidate power, enosis would become a permanent reality and the Turkish presence on the island could be eradicated. But launching a unilateral military invasion against a fellow NATO member was a massive gamble that could invite crippling international sanctions or trigger a catastrophic regional war. Ecevit first attempted to play by the rules of international law. He immediately invoked the 1960 Treaty of Guarantee and reached out to the United Kingdom, proposing a joint Anglo-Turkish military intervention to restore the constitutional order of Cyprus.
Ecevit urgently flew to London to meet with British officials, hoping the presence of British forces would legitimize the operation and deter Greece from retaliating. But London hesitated. The British government, weary of conflict and reluctant to provoke a war with Greece, refused to commit troops. Meanwhile, in Washington, U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger scrambled to contain the fallout, urging restraint and dispatching an envoy to buy time. The Americans desperately wanted to avoid a war between two vital allies on the southern flank of the Soviet Union. They asked Ankara to wait for diplomacy to work. But for Bülent Ecevit, time had run out.
Intelligence reports indicated that Greek military reinforcements might soon be moving toward the island, and the window of opportunity was rapidly closing. Flying back to Ankara on July 19th, Ecevit realized that the international community was paralyzed. The British would not help. The Americans were stalling. The United Nations was debating. If Turkey was going to act, it would have to act alone, and it would have to accept the terrifying consequences of defying the entire Western world. Meeting with his top military commanders deep into the night, Ecevit crossed the Rubicon.
The decision was no longer about if Turkey would intervene, but how quickly the military could hit the beaches. As the sun began to rise over the Mediterranean, a massive armada of Turkish warships, loaded with thousands of troops, quietly slipped out of the port of Mersin, turning their bows south toward the northern coast of Cyprus. The 48 hours of political maneuvering were over. The guns were about to do the talking, and the world was about to wake up to an invasion that would change the map of Europe forever. On the morning of July 20th, 1974, the skies over northern Cyprus roared to life, and Operation Attila began. Turkish paratroopers dropped from the dawn sky into the Turkish Cypriot enclaves north of Nicosia, while amphibious landing craft pounded onto the beaches near the coastal city of Kyrenia. It was a massive, uncompromising show of force. The Cypriot National Guard, still reeling from the chaos of their own coup just 5 days earlier, scrambled to mount a defense, and heavy fighting immediately erupted across the rugged terrain. Across the sea, the Greek military junta, the very architects of this disaster, panicked. Realizing their strategic miscalculation, they ordered a general mobilization, threatening an all-out war with Turkey along the borders of Thrace and across the Aegean Sea.
NATO was suddenly staring into the abyss. In Washington and London, diplomats were in a frenzy. U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger frantically worked the phones, desperate to prevent a full-scale war between Greece and Turkey that would completely shatter NATO's southern flank and hand a monumental strategic victory to the Soviet Union. The shockwaves of Bülent Ecevit's military gamble immediately toppled the dominoes of power. Realizing they could not win a conventional war against Turkey and finding themselves completely isolated on the world stage, the Greek military junta in Athens collapsed in disgrace on July 23rd.
In Cyprus, the puppet dictator Niko Samson was forced to resign that very same day. Within a matter of hours, civilian democratic rule miraculously returned to Greece, and the original constitutional order seemed poised to return to Cyprus. A fragile ceasefire was quickly brokered by the United Nations. Ecevit had ostensibly achieved his stated goal. The Greek coup was defeated, the Turkish Cypriots were defended, and the junta was gone. For a brief moment, the world breathed a sigh of relief. But the reality on the ground was far from settled, and the hardest decisions were yet to come.
Peace talks convened in Geneva, Switzerland, bringing together the guarantor powers and representatives from both Cypriot communities. The Turkish military, having established a narrow and highly vulnerable bridgehead on the northern coast of the island, was in a precarious position. Ecevit and his foreign minister, Turan Güneş, arrived at the negotiating table demanding a completely new political reality. They argued that the old system was dead and proposed a federal state where Turkish Cypriots would have autonomous administration over a substantial, contiguous portion of the island.
The Greek and Greek Cypriot delegations, feeling the immense weight of the demands, asked for 36 hours to consult their governments before making a decision. Ecevit suspected this was a stalling tactic. He feared that international pressure would rapidly mount, forcing the Turkish army to withdraw under diplomatic duress, leaving the Turkish Cypriot population vulnerable once again. The 48 hours of political maneuvering that had launched the first intervention were about to be mirrored by a cold, calculating diplomatic strike. When the Greek side refused to immediately accept the Turkish demands, Turan Güneş made a secure phone call from Geneva to Ankara.
He spoke a simple, prearranged code phrase: "Let Ayşe go on vacation." Ayşe was the name of his daughter, and this seemingly innocent sentence was the exact signal Ecevit was waiting for. On August 14th, the fragile ceasefire shattered. The Turkish military launched the second phase of Operation Attila. This was no longer a limited intervention to restore the constitutional order. It was a full-scale offensive designed to unilaterally redraw the map. Within 3 days, Turkish armor swept across the Mesioria plain, pushing rapidly southward until they had captured roughly 36% of the island's territory. They halted only when Ecevit gave the order, stopping at a line that would become forever etched into the geopolitical landscape of the Mediterranean. The human cost of this sudden and violent shift in power was utterly devastating. Roughly 160,000 Greek Cypriots fled from the advancing army in the north to the safety of the south, leaving behind their homes, their businesses, and their ancestral lands in a matter of hours. Conversely, over 50,000 Turkish Cypriots eventually moved from the south to the newly occupied north. Cyprus was no longer a mixed mosaic of communities.
It was forcibly unmixed, split down the middle by barbed wire, sandbags, and a desolate strip of no man's land. Bülent Ecevit's decision achieved a tactical victory for Ankara, but it unleashed a strategic nightmare that reverberated across the globe. The international community, which had shown some degree of understanding for the first intervention, fiercely condemned the second offensive as an illegal military occupation. The United States Congress, outraged by the use of American Cypriots in an offensive war against a fellow ally, slapped a crippling arms embargo on Turkey, plunging Washington and Ankara into a deep diplomatic freeze.
Greece, deeply embittered by what it perceived as NATO's failure to stop the invasion, temporarily withdrew its forces from the alliance's military command structure. The southeastern flank of NATO was practically paralyzed at the height of the Cold War. Today, more than half a century later, the dust has never truly settled. The capital city of Nicosia remains the last divided capital in Europe, physically split by the United Nations buffer zone, famously known as the Green Line. To the south lies the Republic of Cyprus, an internationally recognized nation and a member of the European Union. To the north lies the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, a breakaway state recognized only by Turkey, entirely isolated under severe international embargoes. Bülent Ecevit went down in Turkish history as a decisive, unwavering hero who saved his compatriots from annihilation, while in Greece and Cyprus he is forever remembered as the architect of a brutal and illegal partition. The 1974 Cyprus crisis remains a chilling masterclass in the unintended consequences of geopolitical gambles. It proves a terrifying reality of modern statecraft. Military action can redraw a border in a matter of days, but diplomacy can fail to fix it for generations.
In the span of just 48 hours, an island paradise was broken, an ironclad alliance was fractured, and a Cold War flashpoint was frozen in time, leaving behind a tragic physical monument to the exact moment when two NATO allies chose collision over compromise.